Glad you guys are here this morning. Let's give it up for our worship team. And they do such a great job every single week. And everyone behind the scenes in AVL, we're so appreciative and thankful for them and the gifts and talents that God has given them. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Jonah. Jonah chapter 4. We've been in a series for the past 4 weeks on the book of Jonah. Today we conclude that series. And my heart and prayer is that God has been speaking to you through this book and how this book is not about a big fish, but it's about, in reality, you're Jonah, I'm Jonah, and God's big mission, his bigger story is to change the world and to restore and rescue sinners, and how how we have joined him in this mission. It's not about a fish. It's about a God of mercy, God of love, God of second chances, and how we can join him in rescuing and restoring the world. And so, hopefully you received a worship guide when you came in this morning. A lot of great announcements, as Alyssa has said, of what's coming up. But on the back of that worship guide is a place for you to take notes. And I really want to encourage you to do that as we end this series this morning. God called Jonah to go to Nineveh, to share the gospel, to tell the good news to the Ninevite people. Jonah rebelled. Jonah said, I'm not doing that. It's not a part of my job description, and I'm running as far away from it as possible. He rebelled and sinned against God. God saw him in that moment, didn't rebuke him, but he met him exactly where he was at. And on that ship that he went down to Joppa and fled from God, a storm arose, and Jonah knew that he couldn't escape from the will of God. And so Jonah submitted to God and jumped in, really was tossed in. He didn't jump, he was tossed in to the depths of the sea, and a big fish swallowed him, was in the belly of a fish for 3 days, 3 nights. In that belly, he got very real with God. Just like you have been there, I've been there, all of us have been there, where we've really had a moment with God that it was very personal. And in that prayer, in that moment, God wasn't distant from him, but he was there, he was speaking, he was moving in it. Jonah finally surrendered to his promises, his ways. God spoke to the fish. The fish spit Jonah out onto dry land, and God came to Jonah again, because God meets us in those moments that we say no to him. Those same moments. Because he's a God of second chances. His mercy and his love and his compassion. And God said to go to Nineveh and share the good news of Jesus Christ. An 8-word message, 5 words in the Hebrew language, that transformed thousands of lives. People turned from their sin and repented and trusted in Jesus. Now, once again, you're not going to be that lucky this morning. You're going to have much more than 8 words. But we get to Jonah 4. And so if you have your Bibles, Jonah chapter 4 is where we're going to be this morning as we end this series. But it says this in verse 1. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry. Now, if Jonah ended in chapter 3, it would be a classic ending, right? God calls Jonah, Jonah rebels, God meets him where he's at. God calls Jonah the second time, Jonah surrenders, and thousands of people, repentance led to revival. It's an amazing book, it's an amazing movie. Everybody stands up and applauses as it's finished. It'd be an awesome ending, but that's not the ending. Jonah 4, because of all this, you'd think that Jonah would be sitting up straight, confidence. He was just used to transform thousands of lives. But instead, we see in the very beginning of Jonah 4 that he's angry. He's displeased of the work that God did through him. He submitted to God. He did exactly what he was told to do. But his heart wasn't fully in it. He had a heart problem. if you can't celebrate the fact that several thousands of lives have been transformed by the good news of Jesus Christ, then you got a heart problem. He submitted to God and did what God told him to do, but he still wasn't all in. You still see the dilemma that he didn't want to do this. He did it because he didn't want to go back into the belly of the fish. I don't blame him. Sometimes we do things out of fear, or we do things because of consequences. We do things, we're obedient to things, but we don't surrender. We're not all in. And we see that in this case. He didn't want Nineveh to be forgiven. Verse 2, and he prayed to the Lord and said, O Lord, is not this what I said when I was yet in my country? That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish. For I knew that you are a gracious God, merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and relentless from disaster. We see Jonah is trying to justify himself for his rebellion towards God. This is why I didn't want to go. I know you're a merciful God. I know you're full of grace. How dare you, God? You're so forgiving. Love, mercy, grace. This is why I didn't want to do this. This is why I ran 1,500 miles away from the presence of the Lord, because I did not want this to happen. I knew this would happen. I was right, God. And Jonah is so selfish, and his heart is very hard. And he loves looking at the rebellion and sin of others, but not himself. We don't do this, right? You don't do this. I don't do that. Where we look at everybody else's sin and the mistakes that they've done in their life, but we can't look in our hearts and our minds. Jonah's first prayer was a cry for help in Jonah 2. Fear now comes from an angry heart in Jonah chapter 4. Jonah prayed his best prayer in the worst place, in the belly of a fish. And here we see Jonah coming to God in anger at the greatest time of his life, the result of thousands trusting in Jesus, and still God is listening. He's still present. He's still by Jonah's side, and he's meeting him exactly where he's at. Verse 3. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. And the Lord said, do you do well to be angry? Jonah would rather die than not have his own way. It is better for me to die than to live, Jonah says. I want it my way, and if I can't get it my way, I'm out. Really, Jonah? Really? Jonah has some serious heart issues going on. He has idols in his life that he has not fully surrendered. Now remember in Jonah chapter 2, we talked about idols. When Jonah was in the belly of the fish and he was scared for his life, and he had so many things going on, but it revealed several things in his heart and mind. And look what it says as a reminder in Jonah chapter 2 verse 8. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. The reason he can't celebrate and thank God is because he has idols in his life that he has not fully surrendered. And Jonah's idol is that he loves his identity, his self-image. And we all have idols in the room. And we're going to walk through those. And so if you're taking notes this morning, we see number one, that Jonah is an adulterer. Jonah has idols. And right now in Jonah chapter 4, where we should be celebrating and having a classic ending of what God does because God is the author of salvation, we see that Jonah is still struggling. This is what idolatry is. Idolatry is when you build your identity on something besides God. That's what idolatry is. We all have identity. We all have something that defines us. I have worth because what? Fill in the blank. I'm a good mom because what? I'm a good person because what? I'm good at my job because what? When you build your identity on anything other than how God feels about you, you are an idolater. When your identity is built on anything other than God's love and acceptance in your life, you become fearful and hateful. And Jonah was concerned with his reputation, not only before the Ninevites, but for Israel, his own Jews back home. His Jewish friends would want to see that city destroyed. If Jonah's friends saw that he was a means of saving them, he would be known as a traitor. And so Jonah's heart is not for them. Jonah's inner circle is not for them. The Israelite people, it's not for them. Jonah saw the Nineveh people as a dangerous enemy to be destroyed and not a company of people that Jesus needed to restore and rescue. He knew the attributes of God: mercy, goodness, compassion. But this led him to be angry and hateful towards the compassion of God. Here's another form of idolatry. Idolatry is when you desire something more than God. When you desire something more than God. When I find more happiness in being successful in my career than find in knowing God, that's an issue. When I find more delight in being rich than knowing God, that's an issue. When I find more delight in the dream of whatever it is, or getting married or having kids, in knowing the goodness of God, then that is an issue. And Jonah has more delight in the prosperity of Israel and the destruction of the Ninevite people than he does in knowing and delighting in God's plan. Sometimes I want my plan, I don't want God's plan. Sometimes I feel like my plan's better than God's plan. And right here we see the dilemma of what Jonah is really battling, the idols in his life. And Jonah's heart reveals anger and unforgiveness. Idols are things we derive pleasure from more than God. We seek refuge in more than God. What are those things in your life? Things that you seek more than God. Things that you find refuge in more than God. We all come into this room, sinners, miss the mark, have issues, situations, circumstances. And here in Jonah 4, we see what's really going on in the heart of Jonah. But also, not just idols, we see that he's ignorant of the grace that God has extended toward him. The ignorance, he's naive of the grace that God has extended towards him. I know God is a compassionate God. That's why I didn't want to go to Nineveh. He's resentful of it. If anybody should be shown the compassion of God, it should be Jonah. Jonah should have felt that from the very beginning. From the time that he rebelled against God, when he fled towards the presence of God, God was still there. Mercy, grace, compassion. When he was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, God was there speaking and moving. In the storms, he was there. In the second chances, he was there. If anybody should know the compassion and feel the compassion of God, it should be Jonah. But instead, Jonah saw the Ninevites' sin and his sin on two different surfaces. You see, when you see yourself as a recipient of great grace, then God's compassion becomes his most precious attribute to you. That it doesn't matter if you've made one mistake or 1,000 mistakes, small sin or large sin, we're all in need of a recipient of God's grace in our lives. And Jonah probably saw his sin and Nineveh's sin in two different categories. The Ninevites are adulterers. They worship idols, they're murderers, they're cruel, they rape women, they boast on all this stuff. I haven't done any of those things. But what has Jonah done? Jonah has said no to God. Is there any sin greater than that? I mean, in all honesty, it's a direct rebellion towards God. And that's the biggest sin we can ever commit in our life. In fact, that is the only sin that separates you from a perfect God. Because I don't know how many sins that you've made or what's going on in your life, nothing separates you from the grace of God. The only thing that separates you from the grace of God is complete rebellion towards Him, saying no. And that is what Jonah is doing. Now remember in Jonah chapter 2, we talked about, I'm going to remind you, you're never farther away from God than when you're close to Him and say no. That it doesn't matter what God's called you to do, that we put our yes on the table because we know His promises, we know His truths, we know His goodness, and it's amazing every single time. And instead of running towards God, sometimes we run the complete opposite direction. Jonah doesn't see his need for compassion and grace. And so he's angry, he's resentful when it expressed to those around him that need it the most. And you can write this down: a spirit of unforgiveness and a lack of generosity is the indication that you are out of touch with the grace of God in your life. A spirit of unforgiveness, meaning that I'm better than they are, I don't need it, I'm a good person. Good people don't go to hell, sinners go to hell. And we're all missed the mark. We all come into this room, sinners. It doesn't matter if it's me or you, we've all sinned. We've all made mistakes. And so when we see the unforgiveness of someone in someone else's life, and we don't see the generosity, what is generosity? We give our time, effort, energy, resources to people. You're never more like Jesus than when you give. When we are out of touch in those areas, and they do not show in the reflection of who we are, then God's not really present in your life. And I want to say this about this church. You are a welcoming body. Every single person that comes into this place feels welcomed. They feel belong. It doesn't matter who walks through those doors. It doesn't matter their background. It doesn't matter their situations. It doesn't matter what they did last night. They are welcome here. And that they belong because they're a child of God. They're created in His image. And nothing is worse than church hurt and judgment. Especially in Tyler. Tyler's a religious area. Most people are de-churched. What that means is they got hurt by church and they don't want to go to church anymore. Let us as a church be people that meet people exactly where they're at, because that's what Jesus did. But let us also be a church that gives everything of who we are to people that are in need. And because of your generosity, we've seen so many things take place around this campus with renovations, with people coming in, baptisms, salvations, people connecting. Over the past 4 or 5 weeks, we've averaged over 250 people. And it's been incredible, and none of that can happen without the generosity of the people. But not just inward, not just things around the church, but also in the community. Last week, because of your generosity, we got to help a lady that was sex trafficked for 7 years and just moved back to Tyler. And she's trying to get back on her feet. And because of your generosity, we got to help her exactly where she's at. And this past week, our leadership felt really compelled to do this. Now, once a quarter, we try to bless our community and do 10% of our offering goes to some need in our community. And that time is not now, but we felt God speaking. And so 10% of our offering today is going to go to an orphanage in Uganda. Because of some of our members, they have connections there. There's 30 kids that go to this orphanage in Uganda. They don't have anything unless something's given to them. It's hard for them to have hope. It's hard for them to see joy because of their situations and circumstances. And last week, their situation and circumstances hit ground zero as their orphanage had a fire and they lost everything. They're living in a school right now. And so 10% of our offering today is going to go to help that orphanage and get them back on their feet. But also, it's going to help, we're going to send 10% to our East Coast that's been damaged by the hurricane. Nothing is more important than people. People just like you and people just like me that are looking for hope, they're looking for joy, they're looking to be a part of something bigger than themselves. And we are on a rescue mission to help people. A spirit of unforgiveness and a lack of generosity is the indication that you're out of touch with the grace of God in your own life. Let us be individuals in a church that always sees God's grace and compassion. And when God speaks, let our hearts be moved to a yes. Jonah is a picture of us. Most religious people, we don't want the situation and circumstance, so we put our yes on the table out of fear and worry, not out of love and compassion. But this is what delight in God. And you can write this down, but delight in God can't be produced by fear of the belly of the fish. It can only be produced by grace. It can't be produced out of fear. It can only be produced out of grace, wanting more of Jesus, knowing God, following after him. Seeing that Jesus saved you from the belly of the fish, he went into the belly of the fish for you. He paid every ounce of the penalty in your place. And God is not just after obedience. He's after a different kind of obedience, and that is surrender. That is all in. Because we could be obedient and still not be all in. We can still be obedient and not fully give everything of who we are. And Jesus didn't die for just a portion of who you are. He died for everything of who you are, and he wants you to run with everything of who you are to him. Let us be individuals in a church that chases after Jesus. Jonah had a lot of things going on in his life, the same issues that we have going on today. Last part of Jonah in verse 5, verse 11 says this. Jonah went out of the city and sat to the east of the city and made a booth for himself there. He sat under it in the shade till he should see what would become of the city. Now the Lord God appointed a plant and made it come up over Jonah, that it might be a shade over his head to save him from his discomfort. God's always there. He hasn't left you. In your fear, in your doubt, in your situation and circumstance, he's still there. So Jonah was exceedingly glad because of this plant. But when dawn came up the next day, God appointed a worm that attacked the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God appointed a scorching east wind, and the sun beat down on the head of Jonah so that he was faint. And he asked that he might die and said, "It is better for me to die than to live." But God said to Jonah, "Do you do well to be angry for the plant? A plant? Yes. I do well to be angry enough to die. Because I can't see myself out of the situation, circumstance. Maybe you've been there before. Maybe you know someone that's been there before. Where it seems ridiculous, but they can't see out of the bubble that they're in. And the Lord said, "You pity the plant, for which you did not labor, nor did you make it grow, which came into being in a night and perished in a night. And should not I pity Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle. Jesus is saying, really, Jonah, this plant that you did nothing for, you absolutely did nothing for it. You're really going to pity something over this plant. Then why shouldn't I not pity for 120,000 people that are wicked, that are far from me, that need rescue? Really, Jonah? This is where your heart is. Your heart is over something so temporary and a plant that you didn't even do anything for it. Instead of people that were created in the image of God. He says even 120,000 people that don't know their right hand from their left. A lot of commentators and theologians will say that a lot of this is kids. Kids that need hope. They need rescue from their sin. So how does Jonah end? Well, let's keep reading. What's the next verse say? There's not one. It ends on a cliffhanger. It ends with a question, because the book is a question for most of us in this room. It's a question for you, and it's a question for me, and it's this: do you care? Do you care? God mentions 120,000 people. The significant is in that number is not just a number, but it's individuals, it's stories, it's people. And that's why numbers matter, because they're people. People that were created in the image of God, that have a purpose, that have a life, and God cares about every single one of them. Do you care that there's 2.2 billion people in the world that have never been accessed with the good news of Jesus Christ? That Tyler is one of the fastest growing cities, not only in the state of Texas, but in the country almost. People are flocking towards this city, looking for hope. They're retiring and they're looking for the next. They're starting their careers and they're looking for the next. Do you care? And let me be very blunt with you. The last tears that you shed, what was it for? For things? For stuff? For temporary things like a stupid plant that withers and comes? Or is it for people that need to be rescued by the good news of Jesus Christ? Do you care? What God's trying to say in this book of Jonah, that God is a God that wants to restore and rescue people. It doesn't matter where you're at in this room, where you find yourself, the sin in your life, the sin that's entangling your heart and mind. He wants to save you. He wants to change you. And He wants to use us to accomplish that task and partner with God in it. Why do we have so much passion for the things that don't really matter at all? And so little passion for the things that actually do. We get so focused on the temporary things that we miss the eternal things, and that's people. People that are far from God. People that are dying and going to hell. And the question I want to ask you as we end this series on the book of Jonah, it's a question that all of us have to ask ourselves, and it's this: are you engaged heart and soul in the mission of God? Are you so engaged heart and soul, with everything of who you are, that God created you first and foremost to have a relationship with Him. That He could save you no matter where you're at this morning. And it's by grace through faith. Putting your faith in Jesus Christ is the greatest thing you can ever experience. And if you've not done that this morning, if you've never had that moment, then you're always going to be looking for something else to fill that void. And Jesus is the only person. But if you have experienced that, then your biggest mission in this world is to help other people find Jesus. There's no other greater need in this world that's more than that. Because people are God's primary focus. Church, let us never run away for that mission. Let us do everything we can. Give ourselves resources, time, energy, effort, whatever it takes to live the greatest mission out there. This book is not about a fish. This book is about God's promise to restore and to save people far from God. And He wants to use ordinary people like you and ordinary people like me to accomplish that task. Do you care? And how are you going to respond?